Dzień dobry Państwu ponownie.
Good afternoon once again. Welcome to what I think is the most interesting panel because what happens at the end is most interesting. Cream of the crop. We're going to talk about financing of hydrogen projects, about money, to say it briefly. So I'd like to invite Mrs. Paulina Brzezicka, Innovation Financing Advisor, European Investment Bank. Paulina joins us online. I have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Wojciech Hahn, President of the Management Board of Bank Ochrony Środowiska, and a man of incredible capabilities, because I've known Piotr for many years and in many disguises, but I think it's the most important one so far. So Mr. Piotr Wrzenka from the National Fund of Environmental Protection. We'll talk about financing because Paulina comes from the furthest. So let me start with you. I'll also partially advertise what we've done together so far. The European Investment Fund has signed with the Hydrogen Technology Cluster an advisory contract for financing hydrogen projects. Could you tell us a few words about what this cooperation will entail, and perhaps at the same time you could expand, because, well, we are another successive agreement that has been signed. Before, I think you signed an agreement with France, with Portugal. I'm very proud of the fact that we were 1 week before the biggest hydrogen organization signed this agreement. It's Hydrogen Europe. So, Paulina, I would like to ask you about the effects. Do we have any benchmarks in Poland we could actually make use of already? Good afternoon and welcome to all. Thank you very much for the possibility of participating in the conference, this new hybrid module, because perhaps before I'll move into the details of our cooperation, I'll tell you a few words about European Investment Bank I represent today. It's a European Climate Bank, in fact, which has put in front of itself very ambitious goals of financing those projects which contribute to implementation of environmental and climate policy goals. We have 3 main goals. Starting the end of last year, all the projects financed by us have to be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. Starting with in 2025, half of all the projects will be strictly aimed to those companies, those projects which are 100% dedicated to climate and sustainable development. And the plan is for the nearest decade, that is until 2030, to mobilize €1 trillion of investments. It's an incredible amount, hard to imagine, and to reach these two goals. So our ambitions are huge, and due to these great ambitions, we have to carry out various contracts, agreements for cooperation in order to create this pipeline to be able to finance these projects at such scale. That's why we've signed an agreement for cooperation in July with the Polish cluster of hydrogen technologies. These agreements are based on, and it is the way you've mentioned, basically. We have such agreements with various organizations, but basically it's based on bringing advisory functions, financial capabilities closer to local companies from various countries. So in a sense, this entails an exchange of information. This is somewhat easier for us as bankers. We are in Luxembourg, after all. We have easier access to projects on spot in local markets. So thanks to that, we'll be able to mobilize financing to meet those great ambitions that I mentioned. Thank you very much. Could you mention perhaps the experiences you've had so far from the agreements you had entered into before? Perhaps there are already some interesting results, because in the formula of the function of the European Investment Fund is the fact that you do not finance completely, not 100%, but you finance a certain part of the projects depending on the character of the project scale. And among others, it's an element which can, and I'll ask Mr. Chairman about it in a second, that commercial banks basically supplement the financing of the project. So perhaps you could tell us a few words about that. And continuing the question about benchmarks, are there any good experiences already? We could use CS. We have such experiences already when it comes to investments into hydrogen. These are large projects, great-scale projects, which we deal with many parties, and this cooperation has been very useful. I don't want to mention concrete transactions because some of them are still being carried out, but quite soon we will have some very interesting information that will be made available. So, to put it briefly, once we enter an agreement with you, we'll be able to use your advisory function. Definitely, of course. Thank you very much. So at this point, I'd like to move onto our domestic market. Perhaps we'll talk about Poland a little bit. The National Environmental Protection Fund is very active when it comes to financing zero-emission investments. More and more frequently, we meet with initiatives connected with financing hydrogen technologies as well. Of course, it's true that today during panels we've talked on many occasions about financing public transport based on these technologies. But Piotr, perhaps you could widen this point of view and the offer that the National Environmental Protection Fund has, because the fund has certain goals which are which are stated in the documents prepared by the government. But perhaps you could expand on these issues. Thank you very much. Thank you for the possibility to participate in this very interesting conference. I've been listening with interest to the previous panels when the National Fund was mentioned. Perhaps I'll take this opportunity to show you a few slides illustrating how we finance hydrogen projects in the National Fund and how we plan to finance them in the future. Perhaps I'll move next to the screen. Perhaps a couple of words of introduction. The National Environmental Protection Fund is a very interesting institution. It's neither a bank nor an agenda of handling strictly European funds. It's an organization that has been active since the beginning of the 1990s, a financial agency of operational character, which answers to the Minister of Climate and Environment, which implements its goals, takes steps in various areas significant to the issues of environmental protection. Recently, a special emphasis has been put on wide-scale energy transformation, especially when it comes to the support of the developing hydrogen economy. An example of that is creating a new Department of Innovation and Modernization of Economy that has been created, and I have the pleasure of heading it. And starting this year, we have also had two channels of financing where fragment of large priority programs is also the hydrogen factor. And at this point, I'd like to mention closer what do we do. Here in the center, we see the National Recovery Plan, because it's the only completely certain source of financing of hydrogen projects, but we have a number of other national funds, the program New Energy or the program Green Public Transports. These are two priority programs which are active right now. Each of them contains a certain hydrogen element.
but it seems that the national recovery plan is somewhat too limited when it comes to financing, to building hydrogen economy, limited due to two aspects. First of all, the budgetary constraints, about 800 million euro are meant for hydrogen projects, including R&D. And it's also limited time-wise. Many of the projects, especially those which are wide in the investment scope, go beyond the framework of the National Recovery Plan. Therefore, it will be definitely necessary to supplement this source with additional ones, and this is what we are working with the Ministry of Climate to find such financing sources. And here on the slide, at the top, you can see the planned program of hydrogenization of the economy. This is the working name of the program. Probably it's going to be a strictly hydrogen-based program, which we will initiate next year. Perhaps in a second I'll give you more details about it. A little untypically of me, perhaps, but I'll say that I'm all for open information about saying clearly what's in the plans, what's in the pipelines, because it's very important for business to know ahead. And it's very good if we can share this information at a relatively early level. As far as the new energy program, here you see the 6 areas it deals with. One of them where we have so-called pilot recruitment was the production, transport, storage, and use of hydrogen. The program is aimed at entrepreneurs. It deals with implementation of innovative technologies into practical applications, commercial applications. Therefore, it is aimed solely at entrepreneurs. Of course, the amount of financing, the time frame is available on our webpage. I don't want to take up time. I'm sure the discussion will be very interesting. The entire budget is 2 billion zloty, 2.5 billion zloty, and 600 million for hydrogen projects. The first call, first recruitment, about half of this budget is already calling for about half of that budget. The next round will be next year. And this is no longer a secret either, so perhaps I'll present that because the call has been completed. Among all the products that all the projects that have been that applied, we've gone through a certain pre-selection process. You can see the 6 projects which passed with success, the so-called fish cards projects. I've met some of the beneficiaries of these projects here directly or on online, so I'm very happy that we are all part of this hydrogen family that has been mentioned in the previous panel. As you can see, these measures are aimed both at production of zero-emission, low-emission hydrogen, at storage. We have 2 projects dealing with those issues, and also ones dealing with fueling stations and building a factory of hydrogen buses. I must say that all these projects that have gone through selection, they have sufficiently specific business plan which allows them to go through this pre-selection. It's no longer any half completed vision. We've been partially very pleasantly surprised at how advanced are some of the projects in this company. And this was one of our, this is what worried us, that perhaps the market is not quite ready for these types of projects where the level of, let's call it subsidies, or grants is not not high, and these projects need to be able to defend themselves commercially. Nevertheless, we can see that such projects can be found. There were other ones mentioned as well, but none of them were able to actually send in their applications. So we've carried out numerous talks with potential industrial partners. The second program, which also has a hydrogen component, which raised quite a bit of emotion on part of self-governments. It's the green public transport. This is carried out by another department. By the way, it's mostly directed at electromobility and battery-powered transport. But still, a smaller part of the budget is aimed at supporting purchase of hydrogen buses and further perspectives, support of the infrastructure of fueling hydrogen stations. We are completing talks with the European Commission about the possibility of support in such a program. Probably my colleagues are going to mention that in detail in the next edition. We talked about the founding principles of the program. The entire budget is 2 billion zloty. One should mention that the first call was very quickly completed. Several governments applied very quickly for this type of assistance. One can debate whether this form is the best. There's quite a bit of criticism towards this program from the side of the local governments, so it'll probably evolve in the second edition, but I have information that at least 2 cities will decide to purchase over 40 buses powered by hydrogen in the nearest future. One city resigned, even though it was planning, I think, an experimental purchase of only 3 buses. So this mostly refers to, there's a question regarding larger cities which have a smaller degree of subsidies but greater needs. So it's a question to our colleagues how it should be. And a question we are working on, hydrogenation of the economy. It's made of 2 parts in this program. We'll have space for financing those projects which apply for assessment in the IPCA mechanism. We have 9 projects like that coming from Poland. These are very large projects, very interesting. Some meant for years and going outside of the KPO time frame. But we'll see. We'll see how the assessment will go. We'll have it very soon. These projects come back to the country, to national financing, and this program of hydrogenation of economy will be a financing tool, financing it in a certain part. The second part, the working name we gave it, is financing of national projects. That is the remaining ones which either haven't received the IPCA acceptance because there are certain interesting projects which actually were rejected in earlier phases or simply did not apply due to less strategic character EU-wise, but having more of a local domestic character. So here we want to support mostly use of hydrogen, its transport, its storage, its production, especially when it comes to production of fuel cells and their use, tanks, pipes, transfer, also liquefaction of hydrogen, and of course production capabilities of electrolyzers and use of electrolyzers. So we've come to a conclusion that these are basic units which have to be bet on, which will play a key role in hydrogen economy. We'll need a lot of them. Simultaneously, there is this phenomenon taking place where Polish companies which plan these large projects have to wait for at least a year or longer to receive offers even from those manufacturers who are currently offering such projects. So it seems that this direction is quite significant to us. That's all from me. I wanted to ask a question, if I may, because you've mentioned these large IPCA projects. Yes, large projects, very large projects, some of them. It's no secret that some of them go over 1 billion zloty in budget. We had first presentation of Tauron in the beginning, who talked the PCHET project. Not all of them are that big, not all 9. So I wanted to ask Piotr if, because it's probably most important for those who are watching it, because champions will always be able to handle themselves by the financing of national projects. Do we have any thresholds when it comes to the size of the projects? Here we want to carry out somewhat larger projects. We want to supplement this offer of new energy. Perhaps the program of new energy will also be present in the second edition next year. It will be somewhat modified then. We think so. These are going to be programs which will be working simultaneously, and they shouldn't compete with each other in that respect. So here we'll have probably projects above 10 million in size. This is the initial plan. We'll see how it will turn out. Thank you very much. So I will give you a moment's rest. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask you a few questions regarding planning by the Environmental Protection Bank. First of all, thank you very much. I thank you for invitation.
Getting ready for this meeting with you, I browsed the strategy of the Environmental Protection Bank, Bank Ochrony Środowiska, and in order to be a credible partner to talk to you, I had to also read the strategies of other Polish banks, which are banks with a typically Polish capital. There are banks that have implemented their taxonomy in the West, but I wouldn't like to focus on them. Perhaps a colleague from European Investment Bank can correct me. Taxonomy has not been implemented by any bank as it has not been defined yet. Maybe perhaps from Bank Ochrony Środowiska, so Environmental Protection Bank. Okay, but reading Western strategies, I can show you some paragraphs. Well, some of them are boasting that they've been working, following these rules already. But anyway, reading the synopsis of this hydrogen strategy that I had a chance to read, it was clear that your bank was going to be green, supporting various initiatives, but there was no hydrogen mentioned. So on the one hand, we are talking about financing hydrogen projects. On the other hand, I would like to ask you how your bank approaches it. Well, some terms are lost in translation, as they say. So apparently hydrogen in our strategy was lost in the synopsis rather than translation. Well, hydrogen, of course, occupies a prominent place in the strategy of our bank. But in the public version of it, in the abbreviated version, we do not talk about it directly. And the reason for not having it in the abridged version, which might actually lead to another question, is that we still perceive the entire ambition and aspiration concerning hydrogen-based economy, as the director mentioned here, as something that is a matter of the future and of plans. As for the bankability of such projects and the possibility of covering with a bank credit, these are the projects that I would say are very well suited for, first of all, applying for all sorts of financing that requires no return, that is grant-like financing. Secondly, these are the projects that very often require, and again I would like to refer to my bank strategy, require an element of advisory, as mentioned by our colleague from European Investment Bank. It is common knowledge that among ourselves bankers, we say that we do not suffer from lack of money, but we suffer from lack of projects. And that also concerns hydrogen economy. We'd like to see an increasing number of projects that are fit for being financed by the banks. But in order to do that, we need to sit together with our stakeholders and think what would make it possible to generate a bankable project that is the one that has a strong, credible sponsor, a one in which we have a reliable technology, a one in which there is a clear path of reaching the cash flows that in the future will able to pay back the debt that was taken out in order to construct the project. This element of advisory at this early stage of hydrogen economy is of key importance. And now maybe one more remark or request to refer to what we've heard from Madam Director from EIB. Different to European Investment Bank, the Environmental Protection Bank is a bank. Of course, EIB is a bank, says the director of EIB. Well, I guess we will stick to our convictions here, because you claim that you are a bank, because your name and many of your products prove this to be the case. But I would say that traditional requirements of, let's say, capital adequacy or those concerning, I'd say, accountability to the European banking supervision. In the case of EIB, which is a huge institution not having any other comparable to it in Europe, and in a sense globally either, these are all different kinds of requirements that have to be met by commercial banks. So the restrictions concerning the assessment of projects in terms of their credibility or assessment of sponsors, in terms of their creditworthiness, can be much harsher when they are applied to commercial banks. I'm not saying this to criticize, but rather to advertise, because I think that this is why EIB is such a desired partner for any commercial bank. And the cost at which you can finance projects and the kind of projects and how bold projects you can actually finance, this is a blessing. And I think that it is a blessing to the entire banking world. What does this mean to hydrogen projects? As the Environmental Protection Bank, in the first hydrogen projects to be financed in Poland with banking instruments, we will certainly participate. And we'll participate in these projects. We've been involved in a number of talks pertaining to this prospect, and the two most promising areas for us are that of public transportation, but also hydrogen generation. One should bear in mind that in order to be bankable, such a project has to have a number of stakeholders, out of whom the main business initiator or promoter will not be a single one. For example, when we talk about hydrogen transportation, we are talking about local governments, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about the way of ensuring or financing the generation itself, the manufacturing of hydrogen buses itself. Now, in the end, such a model that is really well thought over as a turnkey one, so to speak, we can say that the elements of this puzzle can be financed with some return instruments, that is either a credit, banking credit, or a leasing option when we talk about financing of infrastructural elements. This is what we've been working on. And I would wish that 2022 is the first year in which we can sign the first agreements for financing. In cooperation with the European Investment Bank, it has always appeared to me that the European Investment Bank has a small team, and that is why they like big projects, because only such projects can be really handled by a small group of people. Correct me if I'm wrong, Paulina. Right at the beginning, Paulina told us about gigantic numbers. We've heard about sextillion. Well, these are money that are delivered by particular membership states, and the money is to be invested in hydrogen projects. In Europe, we invest in hydrogen projects. In Poland, we keep considering it. On the one hand, the IPCEI are large-scale projects. We are talking about hydrogen projects as one that likes the scale, because then it is easier to show this supply and demand that makes it possible for this cash flow to finance repaying the debt later on. Are we in a position to create such projects in Poland? Well, the debates that we had today cast some doubt here, because on the one hand we have strong declarations concerning the supply options, but on the other hand we have problems with generating the demand. And this advisory that we hope to get from the European Investment Bank is to show us how to do that, how to build it. Our colleagues speaking or before our conference, actually, they claim that it has to be there has to be an ecosystem within which hydrogen projects would be realized. Because hydrogen projects have a certain financial gap to them, and this gap will be there for some time to come. So how do you see the possibility of this problem being solved? Paulina first, and then I'll ask you, gentlemen. This is a very well-targeted question, and I would like to share a few observations about this financial gap. It so happens that we've just completed a market consultation round, and I have had a chance to talk to almost 50 actors from all around Europe who are active in hydrogen economy. We asked them what kind of financing related problems they see about hydrogen related projects and why this financial gap was still there. Just to make the situation clear, EIB is a bank, a full-fledged bank, and unfortunately we also see problems with the bankability of hydrogen projects, because we do not grant subsidies. So what we offer are still credits that need to meet cash flow requirements. They need to be profitable. So we face the same challenges. And let me tell you what these investors that we talked to told us about the roots for this gap. And the first problem is the scale. We all keep talking about the scale. This is the capex that is simply gigantic. And many investors say, okay, EIB has access to quite a balance, but many investors don't have access to financing on such a scale. Another problem, as has already been mentioned, is the time horizon of these projects. Usually you plan them for 20, 30 years to come. Investors like to see the return on their investments fast, after 5 or 10 years. And here we are really talking about a long time horizon, which does not necessarily match the cycle of investors who would like to see the return faster than that. And all this leads to those unsecure, uncertain cash flows. To it, we have various market mechanisms, like the price of CO2, of gas. That is why in those projects we cannot really foresee the cash flows. So the entire setup of the projects and all these problems make it necessary for us to cooperate, to get into IPCI projects or to enter into alliances, because this integration of various actors within one project is just necessary. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Of course, I agree with the fact that bankability will come as a challenge, and just to illustrate it, in a project such as, for example, the one of filling up infrastructure, it is important that we understand who will contribute to the credit worthiness. And to my mind, the filling up infrastructure does not necessarily have to be based on the project finance without recourse on the cash flows generated by the infrastructure. Of course, if such examples are possible, well, the more interesting it will be. But the natural stakeholders to consider here are, for example, local self-governments that will govern the bus fleets, the hydrogen bus fleets. This is a more classical source of cash flow to finance or to simply secure the sources of or bet-based or indebtedness-based financing. If it is not controllable, then it will be hard to generate return that will be sufficient to cover the debt. Well, unless we imagine a situation in which this infrastructure is regulated, and if so, then there will be some additional cash flows concerning the actual use of the infrastructure. Then, of course, yes, then a different question arises, because there is always a flip side to the coin, whether such infrastructure will be competitive market-wise as compared to alternative infrastructure. For example, electric buses or other buses. And another component that I would like to mention in the context of financing is the fact that we need to look at different sources of financing. And the one from the banks is just one source. Another indispensable source is the financing, for example, based on grants or in the form of equity. That is capital-based financing. And I'm looking here at the National Fund for Environmental Protection and Water Management, because the National Fund, owing to its position in the market, is in a sense irreplaceable when it comes to those two types of financing, so grants and potential equity-based financing that could strengthen capital-wise the sponsors of the projects with hydrogen at their heart. So the role of, for example, Bank Ochrony Środowiska is to provide advisory and leading the customer through this, say, supermarket with various financial products on the shelves, where we choose an optimum mix for a given project. Part of it can be banking credit or a grant, and also a long-term line from EIB can constitute yet another part, with equity being yet another part to it. And it's only with this kind of approach that we will be able to respond to what is this innovative element of our economy, for which at this point there is no precedent set. We are all learning it from scratch in a way. The question was whether the big player can do more. Yes, in those great projects where you have big sponsors, champions, not only on the local Polish, but also on the European scale. This financial support from such a great entity or security or guarantee of support certainly facilitates identifying the bankability in a given project. If we do not have such a grand sponsor like Orlen, Lotos, or other major entities in Poland, we would have to think about some other source of risk lowering. One of such sources are conventional and pretty well-known BJK guarantees like Business Max that we as Bosch often use in our financial setups with our clients. And the last sentence that I'm going to add to this, you've mentioned our greenness. Yes, compared to other banks in Poland, in our balance, in our credit portfolio, 36% of the credits are green credits. No other Polish bank has even an order of magnitude lower offer. But of course, banks like EIB are pattern setters to us. Of course, I believe that they have a much greater share of green credits in their portfolio. This is also our ambition to get this a similar stage until 2023. So yes, you can be a green bank in Poland, Director. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. President of Bosch that he has actually shared a way of financing those big projects. It's a sustainable financial mix would be an answer. And wherever there is those greater risks, the most preferential ways should be adjusted, complemented by the stabilization of EIB, for example, and a commercial one by, for example, Bosch. I guess that this is the best way out for this kind of endeavors. The structure, by the way, is often the one that there are different components to it that you can approach, dividing them somehow. And when I'm talking here at least about what concerns those projects that in IBCI are applying for quite substantial support. And I would also like to draw attention to the fact that the dynamics of the market situation concerning hydrogen projects is pretty high, and they go in the right direction because their bankability is on the rise. Some 2 years ago, it would be difficult to think about financing such a project from some commercial banking source now. There are already some projects in companies that do not actually need a subsidizing mechanism for them to be implemented. It's just about the other conditions to be met, because the business plan appears promising already. At the National Fund, we're also planning to introduce some criteria to our plans that will guarantee us supporting endeavors that will survive in the market rather than those that are simply cool, but without the umbilical cord, they would not survive in the real world. So we are thinking about this mechanism of establishing together with the National Research and Development Center to establish such a set of parameters resulting from the knowledge of state on the technologies as in their present state of development, so that we do not really let in projects that lag behind in terms of such parameters, because they will simply not stand the test of the competition in the market. So it's simply a waste of financial streams if we direct them towards those projects. So for hydrogen economy, the sooner this bankability is assured, the sooner the projects will better fitted to it, better planned, the sooner they simply look like commercial endeavors, the better to us all. I'm saying it as a person who has spent his life in business, sometimes facing harsh competition. And I think that's the best way So counting on big subsidy levels, on high level of support, in the long run, does not support the project as good as healthy competition and adjusting to the market. Well, of course, it is quite a headache, especially thinking about the new technologies. And here, representatives of the companies that invest in this area, well, I understand that this is their main concern, so meeting those requirements that are attractive market-wise with very advanced technology of the future. Thank you very much. So I have to start wrapping up this interesting conversation. There are a few questions I would be tempted to ask, but, well, the time flies. So summing up, so we would like to see as the emerging of the approach that we have in Poland now. We could merge it with the experience of EIB. That would be a fantastic cocktail that would support hydrogen projects in Poland. But we should create some business models that do not really match the reality of today, because as Piotr said, hydrogen is another steam revolution. We are changing the world completely. We are going to build completely new qualifications and skills. And to it, we will need people that will consciously advise Polish entrepreneurs so that they adjust the best possible financing methods. Thank you very much, Paulina. Thank you very much, President. Mr. Director, thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.